It's so great to have this room filled. I'm Jennifer Rabb, and I have the incredible privilege of serving as the president of Hunter College, where the American dream still comes true. Tonight, I have the honor of welcoming you to Hunter, both virtually, for those of you on Zoom, and in person, for what promises to be an extraordinary and illuminating conference on technology and society in the next generation. Hunter's motto is Mihi Cura Futuri, the care of the future is mine. And toward that end, our school has been educating and inspiring scientists and mathematicians for generations. Alumni like the carbon science queen Mildred Dresselhaus, Arlie Petters, a pioneer of gravitational lensing, and Esther Lederberg, groundbreaking in bacterial genetics. And Hunter College is still the only college in the world to have produced 2 women Nobel Prize winners in medicine, Gertrude Elion and Rosalind Yalow. So we have a deep tradition of supporting scientists who improve our lives. And what a perfect setting to host these discussions, Hunter's crown jewel, Roosevelt House, the one-time home of Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt. Now, Franklin Roosevelt was not known as the technology president, if there actually was such a distinction in the 1930s and 40s. But in hindsight, maybe he should have been. It was 90 years ago, while he was still living here, November 8, 1932, when he returned to the House as the winner of the election for presidency. The country was, of course, in the throes of an economic downturn, and FDR needed to connect with his people. And on top of that, that night, his opponent had still not conceded. What did FDR do? He turned to the most advanced technology available to get his message to millions. On November 9th, the next night, he sat down before the fireplace in the second-floor parlor upstairs and broadcast a live speech to the nation on the radio. The radio, which was the most advanced communication medium of that day. It was the very first fireside chat, a high-tech communications milestone that brought hope to a country devastated by the Great Depression and forever changed the way presidents spoke to the public. And remember, at that period, the inauguration to presidency was not until March, so the presidential transition was headquartered here in this house. And it was here that FDR and his brain trust conceived the New Deal programs that would bring electric power to rural America for the first time ever, once again using technology to elevate society. So as historic as this house is, we have our high-tech history as well. We are so proud and grateful to host this conference presented by Hunter in partnership with UC Berkeley's Institute for the Study of Societal Issues. And a big shout out to our friends in Berkeley, many of you on Zooms, for this extraordinary partnership. It will, we believe, shed new light, not just on the future of technological advancement, but on the vast potential of tech to help build a better, more resilient, and more prosperous tomorrow. We are so pleased that so many of you are able to be back with us in person, and also that so many of you can take advantage of this conference by using technology to connect with us over Zoom. The idea for this conference was brought to Hunter 2.5 years ago by our phenomenal professor, Lynn Chancellor, whose 4-year leadership of our sociology department has helped make the department a national standard setter in its field. She is one of Hunter's best and brightest, a great scholar, a leader, and a public intellectual who has now brought her talents to the CUNY Graduate Center as the executive officer of the sociology department. Lynn, you are an amazing person, but it's really been incredible how you persevered with this conference. And we all agree, Lynn, you could not have been more prescient in proposing a conference on technology. We knew back then when you first had this idea that technology was a force to be reckoned with in arenas from education to social policy to personal interactions. But none of us, I mean really none of us, could have imagined when we discussed Lynn's idea 6 months before the pandemic what the world would look like post-pandemic. In between those points, all of us have been grappling with the challenges of the COVID era. In academia, we have acquired some hard-earned lessons about the relationship between education and technology, and we are still grappling with what comes next. Many of those lessons seem contradictory. What that tells us is the subject is much more complicated than we thought before, and we thought it was pretty complicated then. One example for us When COVID hit in March 2020, we at Hunter put 3,000 classes online in 10 days and sent hundreds of laptops to our students' homes so they could continue classes remotely. And we invested heavily in giving our faculty the equipment and the new schools they needed to teach effectively online. All very high-tech oriented, to be sure, and we felt very successful that we had kept our academic enterprise afloat. But what we've learned from that experience is that the majority of our students, who are surely part of the most technologically sophisticated generation in human history, don't really want to learn on a screen all day, especially students who don't have all the right technology or don't have access to quiet places at home to study and learn or have the right Wi-Fi in their bedrooms. And so for those who were convinced pre-pandemic that higher ed was in physical buildings was now going to be passé, and that remote learning and MOOCs were the wave of the future, the response, we believe, is really not so fast. Our undergraduates seem to prefer to learn in person, and education actually seems to be a high-touch business. But then again, we also learned that technology clearly helps us do our job better in many ways. We learned, for example, that a 15-minute Zoom call is perfect for a student who wants to discuss, let's say, a financial aid problem. In that case, what could be a 2-hour trip to campus and to home again is made easier, simple, and more accessible through technology. So, as I said, it's complicated. And my call to action now to Hunter is that we must find lessons and improvements in the terrible crisis we lived through in the last few years. The challenge for us now is to reach a better understanding of how to integrate the gift of technology into higher education. How can we maximize the advantages and minimize the disadvantages, especially in light of our complex pandemic experience? And that is why, of course, this conference is so timely. And so to all the people here tonight who labored so hard to produce this event and were so disappointed by the number of times we had to postpone it, perhaps there really was a silver lining in the cloud of the pandemic. We have learned so much about from the challenges of COVID, and what you will present to us tonight and tomorrow has taken on a new urgency and will be received with a new appreciation. I spoke before about the conference being the brainchild of my wonderful colleague, Dr. Lynn Chancer, and I want to add the thanks to all of us at Hunter College, to her co-organizer, Martine Sanchez-Jankowski, who is a professor of sociology and director of the Institute for Study of Society Issues at Berkeley. Martine and Lynn, please stand so we can give you a round of applause. We're so grateful. We thank all of the panelists for your commitment to this endeavor and really have great appreciation to our two generous funders of the conference, the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation and the Gerald Huff Fund for Humanity. And there could be no better force of nature to kick off this conference than our keynote speaker, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, best-selling author, distinguished professor at the CUNY Graduate Center, and New York Times columnist, Paul Krugman. It's my honor to welcome him back to Roosevelt House. The last time we had Paul at Roosevelt House was 4 years ago, just after a national study placed Hunter among the nation's top 10 colleges for the ability of our students to improve their lives financially in the years after graduation. Paul, you generously said in a tweet then, quote, "Hunter looks like the equal chance at the starting lines of our ideal imagination." And we know that if Paul Krugman says it, it has to be true. Paul's columns in the New York Times, including a recent series that contextualizes the invasion of Ukraine through the lens of global economic history, has become essential reading for anyone looking to better understand where we are and where we are going. So how perfect that Paul will kick off this important focus on technology tonight. Paul is the keynote speaker of our ideal imagination. His brilliance and expertise are sure to provide the perfect launch point for this important conference. So please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Paul Krugman.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm looking to see if there's a clock here. That's the biggest problem is, so I'll try to keep an eye on time myself. It's clock is a good technology. Anyway, so today my role is to do a big think talk, which is not normally the sort of thing that I indulge in very much. Sweeping issues like technology and its role, and really the title that was given for the talk, extrapolating from the present, I guess I'm doing that. A lot of it is, I want to talk about the past. I want to talk about what technology has done to society in the past and what that can tell us about what it might do, and very importantly, what it cannot do or cannot do on its own as we look forward. And so, yeah, I want to talk about that. And as was just pointed out, we've been through a pretty amazing couple of years in which technology played a rather critical role in helping us to manage. And we've also learned some of the limitations. So we were all, I taught my classes virtually. Actually, rather weirdly, I spent 16 weeks on a virtual grand jury in the middle of all of this, where everybody got pretty good at the technology except for the police officers. So technology has certainly been really essential, but I think in a way that may be a bit of a trap, because we tend at this particular moment in history to kind of imagine that we invented rapid technological change, that technological change is something that has only started to happen, or that we live in a moment of especially rapid technological change, which is not entirely clear. We certainly do live in a time of advancing technology, but technology has been advancing for a long time. And I think we can learn a lot from what happened from past advancements. I have, as it turns out, in trying to put this together, I was providentially reading the manuscript. I know Berkeley is involved with this, of Berkeley's Brad DeLong, economist and historian, who has a long gestating book, which I've read in various versions for decades now, but finally Slouching Towards Utopia is coming out in September, but I have the manuscript. It's a wonderful book. It's framed as a history of what he calls the long 20th century, which he says begins in 1870. And there's a reason. In his argument, which I think is about right, 1870 is the point. I mean, technology has been advancing throughout the history of civilization, but it always, up until the mid-19th century, it couldn't outrun Thomas Malthus. Technology would improve, living standards would go up a little bit, population would grow, population pressure would push living standards back down, and so societies were in the Malthusian trap. The ordinary human being lived basically no better at the beginning of the 19th century than they did in ancient Sumer. So a long period in which technology advanced but never reached what you might call escape velocity. And obviously we had the Industrial Revolution, which we date somewhat earlier, but Brad makes a pretty good case that the moment when definitively you did reach escape velocity would have been around the year 1870, at which point a substantial part of the world, still a minority of it, but a substantial part of the world, definitely pulled way ahead of the forces of demographic pressure on resources. You started to have really sustained rise in the standard of living. That was, of course, that was not the whole world. That was Northwest Europe, European offshoots, and Japan, pretty much. But it took a much longer time, not until probably around 1990, for a large part of the world to share in that. But we've been in a world transformed by technology now for a century and a half. What did that do for society? What has past technological advancement done? Well, first of all, escaping the Malthusian trap is not to be sneered at. Not starving is a good thing. And rising living standards are a good thing in themselves. There's actually been a lot of research now on the relationship between purchasing power and well-being, as measured by various indicators. And yes, being richer is better. Well, and kind of interestingly, there's no evidence of a satiation point. There's no evidence that there's a certain point when people have enough, and having more income doesn't do anything good for them. That's there always appears to be something else that people can buy, and it's not just competitive consumption It's not just rat race, although rat race is certainly a very big deal. But if we just compare countries, it is true on average that richer is better. So economic growth is good. People are, in general, more satisfied with their lives than they were before technology delivered all of these goods. But it has not, in many ways, delivered what people have hoped. Or when we have had what people might have hoped for it, it has come not through technology alone, but has required other things to happen, especially in the social and political sphere. And so the real starting point for organizing this talk is an old essay, but famous among economists. I don't know how many economists are in the room here, but by John Maynard Keynes, best known for thinking about depressions. But he wrote a rather un-Keynes-like essay in 1930 called "Economic Prospects for Our Grandchildren," in which he asked, what can we hope for for the world? And he said a century hence, which actually we're almost there. It sort of took me a minute to realize that, but it's 92 years ago that he wrote that essay. So we're getting pretty close to Keynes' century. And one of the interesting things about it, in terms of if you think that technological change, technological progress is something new in the world, is that Keynes was very much about, we've had this amazing advancement in technology, and I expect it to continue. So he thought that the world would become very much richer, and that a lot of social changes would proceed from the world getting richer. He actually put a number to it. So the quote, "I would predict that the standard of life in progressive countries 100 years hence will be between 4 and 8 times as high as it is. It would not be foolish to contemplate the possibility of even greater progress." Well, if you actually look at, so this was in Britain, if you actually look at British real GDP per capita, it is now about 4.5 times what it was in 1930. So we're actually, on the one hand, he was right, and the progress, a lot of progress. It's at the low end of his range. So if you think that we've had vastly greater technological progress than anybody could have imagined, you're wrong. We've actually had kind of what we've had is kind of on the low end of what people imagined a century ago. Not a 4.5-fold rise in the standard of living is nothing to be sneered at, but it's not the case that technology has outpaced anybody's anticipations. If anything, it's fallen a bit short of what people hoped it might do. It's probably also worth pointing out that if you talk to technologists, if you talk to people from Silicon Valley, they're constantly preaching that we're in an age of epical, unprecedented technological progress. If you talk to economists, you get a very different story. So again, pardon my economies here. We do have a measure in economics, total factor productivity, which is supposed to be, it's a measure of the economic growth that can't be accounted for by increased inputs. So you accumulate capital, you get a more highly educated workforce, those things cause your economy to grow, but we grow faster than that because knowledge accumulates, because we become more, we have new technologies, we have new ways of doing things. We can do things we couldn't do before. Maybe we can produce things we couldn't produce before. We produce estimates of total factor productivity. They are, at some level, like all of economics, it's a kind of a particularly boring form of science fiction. But we do produce numbers which are at least indicative, for what it's worth, those numbers actually say that the last 45 years or so have been kind of disappointing. So if we take a look at total factor productivity, the generation after World War II was spectacular. TFP, sorry, it's acronyms and abbreviations are unavoidable sometimes here. TFP grew, according to Bureau of Labor Statistics numbers, which are as good as anybody's, grew at 2.1% a year over that from 1948 to 1973. It's been only 0.8% a year since then. So the actual pace of technological progress as measured by the way that economists go about it has actually been rather disappointing for, for the last almost 2 generations. There was a blip in there. We had a period of fairly rapid technological growth from the mid-1990s to the mid-2000s, when we sort of finally figured out what to do with computers. And a lot of people thought, okay, now is the big transformation. And then it slowed down again. And at least as economists measure it, technological progress has been quite disappointing for the past almost 20 years now. Why? There's always a question there. Is that for real? Because after all, are we measuring? We have we have something we call gross domestic product, which is a real gross domestic product, which is supposed to be the total amount of stuff an economy produces. But there are lots of things that we couldn't produce at all in the past, couldn't consume at all in the past. So how do you even create a measure that combines my ability to watch whatever Netflix is serving up tonight with the consumption basket of somebody in 1930? And the answer is, well, okay, there are ways we try to deal with that. It's probably always been the case. Always been the case. It is the case that we are probably to some extent understating technological progress because we don't fully take account of the things that we can do that were just not on the table before. But that has probably always been true, or at least has been true for the past 150 years. And when I try to think about technology and try to have a kind of a reality check on what the economist numbers are telling you, try to think about life, ordinary aspects of life, and whether the rate at which they've changed over some period of which we have some sense, compared with a corresponding previous period. So let's take 1930, Keynes writing about economic prospects for the next century. And so my usual test is the kitchen test. Imagine walking into a kitchen from an earlier era. So if you or I went into a 1930 middle-class kitchen, it would be annoying as hell. It would be, where's the microwave? There'd be a lot of things you couldn't, but you would kind of know how to deal with it, and it wouldn't be all that horrible. Now imagine somebody from 1930 walking into an 1840 kitchen. And the difference over the most recent period is clearly, I think, less. It's a much less dramatic change in the quality of life. There are other things too, sort of various. There are a lot of things. I almost always focus on domestic life because that's where we sort of have some kind of personal ability to evaluate. So just in general, what would living in a home from 1930 be like for somebody from today versus living in a home from 1840 for someone from 1930? I was actually, there turns out to be a little bit more of the story than that, and you don't want to hear the whole thing, but basically the modern flush toilet was invented in 1880 by Thomas Crapper, people who were ill-rewarded for their contribution for humanity. It's hard to think of anyone quite in that category, but anyway, so that was a huge change in the quality of domestic life that has not been matched since. Okay, now, by the way, everything I'm saying, this is only true for countries that were already advanced, right, in 1930. There's a large part of the world for whom life today is inconceivably better than it was a couple of generations ago. You have places like, South Korea is kind of the most spectacular example, a place that went from right on the edge of starvation to a fully advanced country within a single person's lifetime. And China, much more uneven, and the number of people for whom life has become modern has vastly expanded. Our colleague Branko Milanovic at the Stone Center and CUNY Grad Center can tell you all about that the tremendous growth in the in the middle of the world. There's still a bunch of countries that are still have made very little progress, but the vast widening of economic progress, basically technology diffused, so that while technological advance may not have been as rapid as some people imagine, the diffusion of technology has been an incredible thing. So that's a real thing to matter. But if we're thinking about a country like, well, Keynes's Britain or the United States, we live in a period when we've had a lot of technological advance, but maybe not as much as people think. And in particular, we live in, I think, in another one of those periods when people may be expecting technology on its own to do more than technology actually ever does on its own. So in that essay, so when Keynes talked, he wasn't saying, the essay was not, hey, real GDP per capita might grow by a factor of 8. That wouldn't have been very interesting to say. And but his argument was that that Britain, or the advanced world, could have enough technological progress that, as he put it, the economic problem will be solved. That you would become a rich society, would become rich enough to basically stop worrying about being rich enough. That that people would have sufficiency of goods, so that they would not feel the need to work the kind of hours that they were then working, and that that people would stop valuing wealth, stop valuing money as much as they did, because basically everybody would have enough. So there was a speculation in that essay where he talked about he speculated, as actually many people have at various points over the past 90 years, that we would actually have a real problem. What do people do with all the leisure time that they will have thanks to technology? And so he suggested that we might end up that a century hence we might have people would just feel the urge to be doing something, so maybe they would work 3 hours a day, and that they would perhaps do household chores, even if they could be mechanized, simply to keep themselves busy. Well, that didn't happen, obviously. So we certainly did not reach that kind of sufficiency. He also suggested that with the economic problem solved, with there being enough for everybody, that the whole value structure would change, that people would stop valuing wealth, would stop feeling that it was important to honor and reward people who were especially good at accumulating wealth, that we shall be able to rid ourselves of many of the pseudo-moral principles which have hag-ridden us for 200 years, by which we have exalted some of the most distasteful of human qualities into the position of the highest virtues. We shall be able to afford to dare to assess the money motive at its true value, and that the love of money as a possession will be recognized for what it is, a semi-criminal, semi-pathological propensity. Okay, that didn't happen either. Okay, questions to ask here are, why didn't it happen? And what would it take to make at least, I guess the way I would put this is to say that technology has made us richer, has made us better off. It has not appeared to make us better people, and it's not clear that it's made us a better society. And the question would be, why not? One answer, of course, is that, and Keynes kind of knew this, he was kind of eliding it when he was writing it, but that the ability of people to want more, no matter how much they have, and particularly the ability of people to want more than the next guy, no matter how much both you and the next guy have, seems to have no limits. If you take, the United States has had a roughly comparable increase in living standard. We're a little bit richer than Britain now, but we've had the average income is up tremendously since then. It's up tremendously over the past half century as well. It's tremendously, super tremendously, multiplied tremendously up for people at the top of the scale. So I was just looking at this for some other purposes. In 1973, the year before I graduated college, CEOs at major corporations on average were paid 23 times as much as the average worker in their company. Now it's 351 to 1. If CEOs have become kind, easygoing, non-ambitious, non-greedy people, I don't think I've noticed that. It doesn't seem that doesn't seem to matter how much you have. The desire to have more is always there. Okay, I'm going to talk about the bottom of the scale in a couple of minutes, but let me say that it is still, if I want to say that nothing changes on that front ever, that would be excessively pessimistic. So as it happens, just a little less than 30 years after Keynes wrote that essay, a prime minister of Britain, Harold Macmillan, famously told voters, "You never had it so good." And it was true for everybody except the very, very top of the British income distribution. British society in the late 1950s was a much, much better place than British society had been in 1930. Not much of that had to do with the fact that technology had progressed. Technology had progressed. Britain was about 50% richer per capita in 1957 than it had been in 1930, which is actually, it's a better rate of economic progress than we've managed in recent decades here. But that wasn't what made the difference. What made the difference was the coming of the welfare state. What made the difference was that post-war Britain had the National Health Service, that it had unemployment benefits, that it had disability benefits, that it had unions that protected workers' rights, and just a generally much more equal and much more secure existence. So in some ways, the economic problem hadn't been solved in Britain in 1958. And if we were to step back into Britain, then it would probably look pretty shabby to a lot of us. But it was by no means the kind of society had been a generation before, which is a way of saying that technology by itself doesn't do things, but that technology makes it possible. If Britain had had the level of technology that it had had in 1850, you couldn't have had a 1958 style welfare state. But given the technology, you can in fact do pretty amazing things to make societies better. But of course they rely upon institutions, they rely upon politics. They're not something that is given to you by technology itself, and they're not something that you can count on staying just because the technology is advanced. At the bottom, Keynes was arguing, the economic problem is solved, we're all going to have enough. And that's clearly not the way people feel. Economic anxiety. There was that brief period after the 2016 election when everybody was saying that the vote was all about economic anxiety, and it turned out that a lot of it actually, no, it was that the best predictor of the vote was attitudes towards race. But still, economic anxiety is real. There are a lot of people in this country and in other advanced countries, but perhaps especially in this country, who do, despite all of the advances of technology, feel that that things are not good for them. Some of that is because the gains from technological advance have been very unequally distributed. It is really quite startling to look at, again, we may be missing some benefits here that aren't properly counted, but still, at least adjusting for changes in consumer prices, the hourly wage of non-supervisory workers, essentially blue-collar workers or their office equivalents in the modern economy, was about the same in 1973 as it is now. There's been essentially no progress for working people, and the stagnation of purchasing power doesn't fully capture what's happened. You can, even if people have enough money, does the economy supply them with enough dignity? Does it supply themselves with a feeling that they are not failures? And so, and we know that that's been for a significant number of people in this technologically advanced society. there's a feeling of despair, despite all of the technological progress, but probably maybe the single most influential work in economics or social science. It's not exactly just economics, but of recent years has been Ann Case and Angus Deaton's documentation of the rise of deaths of despair among working class people in America. An extraordinary thing to happen in a society that has all of the wealth that technology has given us. Again, it's saying that technological progress makes things possible, but it doesn't necessarily ensure social progress. What about some of the other things that we might want from technology? One of the great hopes I think we've always had is that technology at some point, particularly particularly recent technology, information technology, will be democratizing in multiple senses, that it will open up opportunities for people to do things, to interact, to make themselves heard that were not there before. And so the rise of social media, it's actually strictly speaking before, even with the rise of do people still remember blogging? Anyway, you're old when you still at some level feel that blogs are a new thing. In fact, nobody does them anymore. But we thought that we were going to open up access in a number of ways, that we were going to make society more open to people who previously had no voice, that we were going to open up opportunities to people who were denied, that we were going to actually remove some of the gatekeepers who made us an unequal society, not just in terms of income, but in terms of a lot of other things that mattered. And we have I actually did some rough statistical work for this talk. I was just curious to see what we can do here. We know a great deal about economic inequality. Janet Gornick here heads up the Stone Center for the Study of Socioeconomic Inequality, which is where I sit at the CUNY Grad Center. So we do a great deal of work. One of the things so we have numbers, obviously, a great deal of number crunching. One of the things that turns out to be true is that at high incomes, the distribution of income it's a Pareto distribution. It's a power law. It says that the 99.9th percentile is to the 99th percentile as the 99.99th percentile is to the 99.9th percentile. The question of why is that true is interesting, and also turns out to be a black hole into which many good minds have been lost. So trying to figure out exactly why these power laws prevail, but lots of things follow power laws. And we do know, we can tell you, so I won't give you the Pareto coefficient. Instead, let's just say, it turns out that in the distribution of incomes right now, if you move down by a factor, move down in the rank by a factor of 10, so you go from the 99.9th percentile to the 99th percentile, or the equivalent over any range, it turns out that the income falls by a factor of about 4. So that's incomes at the 99.9th percentile start at about 4 times the level that gets you into the bottom of the top 1%. So that's a kind of, and we've considered that to be a highly unequal distribution of income, as it is. It's the most unequal distribution of income we've had since the Gilded Age. What about other things? What about the things where technology plays a role? So it turns out that there has been some study. So Twitter, social media. So Twitter is the social medium. Actually, it is kind of largely an old person's thing these days, and it's. What about Twitter as a way to have a voice? Because anybody can have a Twitter account, unless you're certain people who have been justifiably banned. But anybody can have a Twitter account and can voice their views to a potential audience of millions and millions of people. But will they read it? And it turns out that Twitter following is extremely hierarchical. So there have been a study of the distribution of Twitter followers among economists, which is kind of, this is an area of public policy. It turns out that economists do Twitter. And so you can you can look at the distribution, which follows a power law, as long as you exclude there's this one guy at the top who is just sui generis, and basically because he has another job. So leaving me out of the numbers, it turns out that, Twitter followership among economists follows power law, and every tenfold drop in rank is a sixfold drop in followers. Twitter followership among economists is considerably more unequal than the distribution of income. It's kind of interesting. So here's this, sounds like a highly democratizing technology, but it isn't in practice. I did look at some of the other social media. I looked at Instagram, and it's interesting, the distribution of Instagram followers, which is basically lifestyle stuff. I learned two things. One is it's a lot flatter than Twitter. The other is that I cannot imagine why anybody cares about these people. And I looked at, I also looked at something where I actually do kind of care, which was musicians on YouTube. Some of them I do actually listen to, and it turns so the number 5 YouTube musician is Ed Sheeran, and the number 49. I don't do 50 because I have no idea who these people are, and I can't pronounce it either. But then number 49 is Dua Lipa, British singer, and Sheeran has about 2.5 times as many followers as Dua Lipa. So it turns out the YouTube distribution is quite unequal, but not nearly as unequal as lots of other things in our society, including the distribution of income. So actually, it probably is the case that particular form, that the ability of lesser known musicians to develop a following has been enhanced by technology. So it's not all one way or the other, but the idea that it's necessarily a hugely democratizing force is not right, and probably in terms of public policy, it's not a democratizing force at all. If anything, maybe the opposite. What about freedom as opposed to democracy? What about the ability to get information out? So we used to have, there were 3 television networks, and there were a handful of major newspapers, and they were controlled access. And surely now, with all of this ability to disseminate things through technology, those gatekeepers can no longer keep the truth from people. Well, after the last couple of years, it turns out that, what's the slogan? Information wants to be free. That's not so clear, but misinformation definitely wants to be free. And so the ability of people to bypass the gatekeepers ends up with people trying to treat COVID with horse dewormer. The moral of the story is, first of all, yes, we've had extraordinary technological progress, really 150 years of extraordinary technological progress. We are still living in that era, although it is kind of important not to buy the hype. It's not at all clear that the technological progress that we're experiencing right now is especially rapid. If anything, in many ways, it may be kind of disappointing by historical standards, but it certainly hasn't gone away. And it has made us richer. It has made our lives better. But technology by itself doesn't make people any better, that's for sure. And technology by itself doesn't necessarily make society any better. It offers the resources to achieve a better society, but it actually takes institutions, politics, effort. You need to work to translate technological progress into a better society. And of course, it's entirely possible that you can have technological progress and become a worse society, which is something a lot of us are worried about all the time these days. So extraordinary stuff. I think one of the things that people would have liked me to do here is tell you what the future of technology is going to be. But of course, I have no idea. Certainly not in a position to judge. I mean, you do kind of, I'm certainly not a pessimist who thinks that the age of breakthroughs is behind us, but I'm not a super optimist who believes that the singularity and the transformation of everything is just ahead of us either. There will continue to be technological progress, but what it does to us is basically up to us, not to the technology. And with that, let's throw it open for Q&A.
I just want to let everyone know that if you raise your hand, I'll do my best to put you in the queue, and then Professor Krugman can actually answer your questions. So keep your hands up, and I'll put you in the queue. Person over here to my right.
Paul? Michael Myers, New York Civil Rights Coalition.
Yeah.
Good talk. My question to you is regarding the media today. We went from a world of the Mad magazine, where that lampooned everybody, social criticism, to letters to the editor, to the New York Times, which New York Times was the decider who gets in, who does not get in. Then we went to technology, and we thought we would have a broader spectrum for criticism, social criticism. And my question to you, therefore, is, in a world, 21st century world of technology, where people are supposed to have access and have the idea of social criticism, lampooning the powers that be, and anybody else we want to criticize, they get censored too. Donald Trump is censored. Glenn Greenwald is censored. Diametrically different people, different poles in terms of political viewpoints. How do we get social media to be more responsive to people who have not had access to the internet, who have not had access to major media? How do we get social criticism?
Yes, okay.
I actually don't think that we're having a problem getting social criticism out there, and there is this peculiar thing, which is that you have individual platforms, and First Amendment rights are the right to speak, not necessarily the right to have an account on Twitter. But there's some, but it's not. I think. But I don't see that as a problem we're having. I don't think that we're having a problem that views are not being expressed. I think the problem that we have is that it turns out that a lot of the views that are expressed are not helpful social criticism. And of course, I shouldn't. I don't know. I'm not saying that I should be in the position to make that decision, but if your idea was that freeing up all of these new platforms was going to lead to lots of good stuff being pointed out, that has not been mostly how it has turned out. And I don't have an answer for that. I think the problem of exactly how you handle I mean, in some ways, it's probably turned out that social media have been have allowed people to say things that that they may have thought before, and that we were better off if they kept it in their own thoughts. But again, I have no idea how to handle it. It's just a bizarre situation we're in. But let's be clear that right this minute, it may look like the technology companies are clamping down on one particular ideology, but if there's a clamp down in the opposite direction, which is highly likely, it'll be far more draconian than anything we're seeing now.
Here, please.
Hi, I grew up in the 40s and 50s, lower middle class to middle class. We had a saying, use it up, wear it out, make it do, or do without. And that's like personal industry. How does that fit in with some of the concepts that you have been talking about? Yes, there's technology, but it comes down to human beings and how we live and treat each other, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, on the whole, I mean, look, yes, I mean, what matter, I mean, consumption goods are not always a bad, not always pointless. It's you'll take you'll pry away my Instant Pot from my cold dead hands. But it's. I think the problem comes when people let's have enjoying some of the good things in life is fine. Defining yourself by how much you have is not fine, and unfortunately, we're still that kind of society.
They'll bring it.
I'm Pam Silver. I'm from Harvard Medical School, so I'm going to have an obvious bias here.
Right.
But I notice in your discussion of technology and through the lens from 1930, you didn't layer on the advances in public health and medicine. And I know that's a very complicated thing, but it feels from my perspective that that is an area that is going full throttle and has made huge advances.
Yes, and it's something that we probably don't measure adequately. That's very. It's one of the. There's a lot of stuff when we talk about stuff that you simply couldn't buy because they didn't exist. The most important of those things are probably mainly medical. You could not. There are just lots of things that were untreatable that are now treatable. And what? Well, vaccines, yeah. I mean, this is, and this, yes, actually, it's, I think mea culpa. I think I talked all about the sort of the miracle of telework and how that got us through the pandemic. But the really important miracle is the mRNA vaccines, which have. And it's certainly the quality of your life is definitely improved if you're not dead. So yes, healthcare is one of those areas. Although I haven't. I'm not sure if we can do this anymore. One thing I did do, again, a little bit of statistical stuff. There was a debate. Already now ancient history to most people. We had a big debate about Social Security and privatization back in the mid-2000s. And one thing that you kept on hearing people say was that, well, when they founded Social Security, they had no idea how much life expectancy would rise. And but you can actually go back to the statistical analyses that were done before the Social Security Act was passed, which included demographic projections up to the year 1990. And actual life expectancy in 1990 was a little bit below what they were expecting back in the 1930s. So so medical technology, medicine has made huge progress as expected. People did not, it is not the case that people 80, 90 years ago were unaware that medicine was advancing. And sure, that's one of the things that probably, well, again, not dying is a pretty big thing, and quality of life. One thing that I don't think that we capture in our measures of life satisfaction is I think there's been a bigger reduction in sheer misery from ill health than we properly take account of in our measurements.
Hi, thank you, Professor Krugman. I have a question about the pace of, or the trajectory of technology seems to be heavily focused on kind of Moore's law, where there's more and more compute and more time is spent on screens. And if you think about the crypto world, it generally is a lot of people trading things, spending lots and lots of time on the screens. And then the metaverse, which is sort of the next big thing, Web3, metaverse, it seems to involve increasing amounts of time. Instead of humans sort of manipulating atoms out in the world, they're spending more and more time glued to screens, living in screens, buying real estate in screens, trading things in screens. Have you thought at all about that as a factor of technology in terms of advancement, or is this actually a direction that's something that's desirable? Thank you.
Okay, so one. Let me see if I can be organized here. Probably not. But let me respond to a couple of things. First, yes, people do spend a lot of time on screens. Although I think that one way of it's not entirely clear how much that differs from other forms of passing the time. I mean, in the end, if you're watching, if you're streaming stuff, or is that all that different from going to the movies was, or how should we regard that as all that different? It is important that we not lose personal interaction, and I think we're all feeling that now after the past 2 years. But I'm not clear how much that's a threat. In terms of the actual, what we really do in the economy, there's a fair bit of optical illusion that makes it seem like the economy is much more virtual than it really is. And the classic, I actually wrote about that in the paper earlier this week, is Amazon feels like this immaculate, untouched by human hands experience. And it's actually, I wonder how many other people here are old enough to remember the automat. And of course, behind those shelves where you put in the coins, there was an army of people rushing to put food into the little, and that's what Amazon is like. Amazon is there. It may feel like it's a website and it's all in cyberspace, and the reality is that there's a million workers getting those products to your doorstep. So I think that's the thing, and crypto actually crypto is one of my cases in point for the illusion of epochal technological change. Bitcoin was introduced in 2009. 2009. So far, nobody has found any significant legitimate use for it. And so you might want to see if things are moving so rapidly, how come people are still gushing about an undoubtedly very clever algorithm, but one that has been around for more than a decade?
So I'm Adam Falk from the Alfred B. Sloan Foundation. So I really appreciated the historical perspective. I'm always trying to tell my kids that they shouldn't think that everything is quite so new. And a lot of this conference is going to be about thinking about how we can have conversations with government, with other non-governmental organizations, within academia, about technology and how we can make it something that is more positive than negative. I'd be curious to know if there are historical lessons that you see, times that we faced a similar situation with technologies that we were worried about where they were going, where we managed through government or academia or whatever to successfully reorient their use in ways that were productive. Or whether you as an economist have a theoretical bias as to how that ought to happen.
Oh, wow. That's a genuinely hard question. Let me give you what I think are related issues, which are electricity and telephones, both of which were initially quite unequalizing. Electrification was very patchy. Took place in some places in large parts of the country, particularly, at the time when electrification was ongoing. Rural areas were often not part of it, and the same was true for telephones. And they eventually became more or less universal rights Of course, everybody has access to the power grid. Of course, everybody has access to the telephone network. And that did not just happen. That happened through deliberate government policies. I mean, famously the Tennessee Valley Authority, but also was heavy subsidization of telephone networks in rural areas. So that was a case where you took technologies that could have been extremely unequalizing, undemocratic, and they were made into, instead, things that pulled us together because the government took an active role in making sure that people had access.
Hi, sorry to cut in, Martine and Mr. Krugman. The Zoom audience are clamoring to be heard from. So I'm going to read a couple questions from our virtual attendees. There's been as many as 100 people with us on Zoom, 150 people, I'm sorry, with us on Zoom today. And first and foremost, we have a question from Dr. Giselle Huff, who is the founder and president of the Gerald Huff Fund for Humanity, one of the generous sponsors of this event. So Dr. Giselle Huff asks, can the slowdown of productivity since 1970 be attributable to the changing role of capitalists who no longer view their function as investing in the future, but satisfying their shareholders?
Okay. Okay, so actually the first thing I do want to say to the Zoom audience is, look, I'm not wearing sweatpants. The technological slowdown, I'd like to believe that there was a simple moral story there, that there was some kind of a morality play. It's not clear to me that that is the case. It's certainly not clear that we have, we worry all the time about corporate short-termism. And that may be an issue, but it's not clear that that's more than it was. And especially on technology, one of the things that seems to be the case is that financial markets are quite willing to support the hope of a future technology. In fact, probably too willing to support the hope of a future technology. But it's worth remembering that there was a long time when Amazon.com was commonly referred to as Amazon.org, because it was a nonprofit, whether it intended to be. It went a long time before it actually started to turn a profit, and investors were willing to support that. So no, I don't think that's the issue. I think a lot of it just is some technological. Sometimes technology is willing, and sometimes it isn't. Some things turn out to have enormously broad applications, and others less. And it turns out that for all of the amazing things it can do, information technology has not yet yielded the kinds of returns that lots of people thought it would.
Shall we have another question from the Zoom?
Yes. Let's see. Francesca Fernandez asks, where do you see technology creating opportunities to explore alternate economic models such as degrowth, particularly as we approach increasing costs of exploitation of natural resources, but also considering the social pressures we face collectively in the pandemic?
Okay. I'm not a degrowth fan. And I think that people who want, so degrowth is saying we should actually have a smaller economy. We should produce less, and we should, given the environmental concerns, that's what we should do. What people who say that I think don't understand is that GDP, or whatever, use GDP, any measure of the size of the economy, it's not a measure of the amount of physical stuff we produce. It's a measure of the value to people of what we produce, which can often be non-material or can be very high quality stuff that doesn't involve actually a lot of natural resources. So there's no necessary reason why GDP, why a growing economy has to mean a growing burden on the planet. It's a question of getting the incentives right so that what we do is the stuff that does not stress the environment. That's not an argument that says that we have to be poorer. It says that we have to produce differently and consume differently, but not necessarily less. And you can see back in the day, no, I won't go there too far there. But if you take a look at one of the areas where I've done academic work over the years, one of the things you find is that the growth in world trade, there certainly has been a big growth in world shipping, enough, so that we've seen the problems you have when that capacity gets strained. But the growth in the value of world trade has vastly exceeded the growth in the number of tons being shipped. And the reason is because a lot of what we ship is high quality products. If you look at the vaccines, by the way, how they're produced, that is an incredible international coordination effort, partly market, partly government driven, in which different bits and pieces of the vaccines are produced in highly specialized facilities in very different parts of the world and shipped by air. And that's, all of that counts as part of GDP. It doesn't use a whole lot of coal and oil. So no, I think that the degrowth thing is getting, defending the environment is critical. Shrinking GDP is not.
Yes, over on the left-hand side here.
It's coming.
Hi, I'm Edna Rosen. I'm a Hunter alum. I've read a lot about how many people are employed, for instance, in healthcare. And then there's technology. Where do we direct our students to study for future employment? Where do you think they should be working or they could be working?
Yeah, of course, truly I don't know, but for what it's worth, people whose job it is, in fact, to sort of project job opportunities, which the Labor Department does do. I believe of the 10 fastest growing occupations, so their projections, 8 of them are some version of nurse. Healthcare. This, and that's fine. I mean, what could be more important than taking care of our health and then generally taking care of people? I mean, it always drives me crazy when you look at some of the politics that goes on now. To look at, to pick a random example, West Virginia, which thinks it's a coal state, and in fact has only a few thousand coal miners, and has huge numbers of people employed in healthcare and social assistance. And as they should be. I mean, because the economy is, the purpose of the economy is to take care of people.
I guess one more question that we'd have, person on the right.
Hi, Dr. Krugman. This is Cristian Gonzalez Rivera from the Brookdale Center for Healthy Aging here at Hunter. So you actually touched on a topic that I've always been very interested in, and that is that it used to be thought in the middle of the last century, earlier than that technology would bring more leisure, that people would have more time to dedicate themselves not just to productive activities that produce income, but in fact have other roles in life. And as an organization that is particularly thinking about what are the roles that people can take later on in life that are not necessarily connected to how much money are you earning, et cetera, what lessons do you think that we might be able to derive from perhaps recapturing that optimism from decades ago and thinking about different roles today?
I mean, there is a bit of a puzzle. Worth pointing out that the United States is an outlier here, that other advanced countries have taken out some of their gains in productivity in the form of shorter working hours. And we have, since about 1970, taken out basically none of them. And so there's something going on there. It's a favorite point, actually, when I teach my class. I do a lot of comparisons of advanced countries. And if you ask why GDP per capita is lower in European countries than it is in the United States, mostly it's because they actually take vacations and we don't. But as to, I think the immediate question should be what is it, which I don't think we fully understand, what is it about the structure of our institutions and incentives that has led us to not exploit any of our progress in the form of increased leisure? And then there used to be a lot of people worrying a lot about what would we do with all the leisure time. But I think we can put that on the back burner until we actually start to give ourselves some more leisure time. And I haven't figured out how to make that happen.
Well, because this is not a religious revival, we actually have to stop. And so I'd like you to join me in thanking Professor Krugman for a wonderful presentation.